Tonight we travel back to a quieter time, to the rural fields of Maryland, to the wide black surface of the Atlantic at night, and eventually to the very top of the world, where the ice stretches on forever and the only sound is the wind moving gently across an endless white plain. This is the life of Matthew Alexander Henson, a man the world forgot and the ice never did. Listen for a moment to the quiet sound of that cold wind moving slowly over the open ocean. Imagine the deep, dark water rolling steadily beneath a heavy sky, and the slow, rhythmic creak of a wooden ship's hull as it settles into the peacefulness of the night. Gradually, the sounds of the restless water fade away, giving way to a profound and heavy silence, the kind of silence that only exists far from the shores of civilization. This is a journey into that deep stillness. We are stepping back into the late 1800s, easing into a world that still moved at the gentle pace of wind and tide. It was an era defined by grand ships with tall canvas sails catching the ocean breeze, and by large, delicate paper maps carefully unrolled on weathered wooden tables under the warm glow of oil lamps. It was a time when there were still vast, blank spaces at the very edges of those maps, places where the ink simply ran out and the quiet unknown began. In this unhurried time, the world still held its mysteries softly, waiting patiently for those who had the quiet endurance to seek them out. In the year 1866, a boy named Matthew Henson was born into this vast and slowly changing world. His story is one of the most remarkable journeys ever taken, yet it holds a central, quiet paradox. He was a man of truly extraordinary achievement, someone who walked further into the frozen unknown than nearly anyone else alive, and yet he spent long decades resting in the soft, quiet shadows of obscurity. We speak of him today as forgotten, gently exploring this word, not as an injustice to be fiercely argued, but as a peaceful mystery to be understood slowly through the telling of his life. So, as we prepare to trace his footsteps, allow yourself to settle deeply into the warmth of wherever you are resting right now. Let the immediate, busy world around you soften and gently fade away, and let your breathing find a slow, steady, comfortable rhythm. There is no rush tonight, no hurried destination, and there is nowhere else you need to be. We are simply going to follow the path of a steady, remarkable man, moving slowly from the warm earth to the cool, quiet edges of the globe. Just close your eyes, let go of the day, and listen quietly as the story begins. We leave the frozen north for a while, letting the cold winds fade into the warm, heavy air of a late summer evening in Maryland. It is August the 8th, in the year 1866, in the quiet, rolling landscape of Charles County. The Civil War has just ended, and the country is slowly, unevenly settling into a new reality. Down here, in the rural expanse of sharecropping country, time moves at the gentle pace of the seasons, guided by the slow turning of the sun and the rhythmic work of human hands. You can imagine the smell of dry earth and cut grass lingering in the air, the distant sound of crickets hidden in the tall weeds, and the soft curl of wood smoke rising from a small chimney against a softly fading twilight sky. It is a world of quiet dirt roads and deep forests, where neighbors know each other simply by the sound of their footsteps on a wooden porch. Into this quiet, recovering world, a boy named Matthew Alexander Henson is born. His parents, Lemuel and Caroline, are free people of color navigating the fragile dawn of a post-war South, working the rich soil with a patient, unyielding grace. Their household is modest, built upon the simple, vital rhythms of daily survival and the profound, enduring warmth of family life. In these early years, Matthew's world is beautifully small and tactile, safely bounded by the weathered wooden walls of their cabin, the rustling leaves of the deep Maryland woods, and the soft, reassuring voices of his mother and father speaking in the low, golden glow of lamplight. It is a gentle beginning, rooted deeply in the quiet earth, but the shape of a family can change, softly and inevitably, much like the gentle turning of a season. When Matthew was only around 2 years old, his mother, Caroline, quietly passes away. Because he is so very young, her departure is not recorded as a sharp grief, but rather as a distant, early absence. It becomes a faded photograph in the mind, a soft, empty space in the rocking chair by the hearth. In the gentle wake of this early loss, his father, Lemuel, steps forward with quiet devotion, doing everything he can to hold the delicate threads of their household together. He surrounds his young son with immense care and steady strength, raising Matthew through the unwinding years of early childhood. Lemuel teaches him to walk the dusty paths, to recognize the changing clouds, and to listen to the comforting rhythms of the countryside. Yet this quiet, rural sanctuary is not meant to last forever. When Matthew is just 7 or 8 years old, his father also passes away, peacefully closing the door on this first, tender chapter of the boy's life. The family home, once filled with the familiar, comforting sounds of Lemuel's steady presence, slowly dissolves into the quiet mist of memory. Matthew is left without the natural anchors of his childhood, drifting gently into the care of his extended family. He is sent away from the open fields and the comforting wood smoke of Charles County, traveling to Washington, D.C. to live under the roof of an uncle and adjust to a completely different kind of life. The transition from the rural quiet of the countryside to the growing, bustling streets of the nation's capital is a profound shift for a young boy to navigate. Washington in the 1870s is a fascinating city of wide, sweeping, unpaved avenues, where grand government buildings rise slowly from the marshland, and a steady, rhythmic stream of people move purposefully through their days. Here, the soft sounds of crickets and whispering leaves are replaced by the rhythmic clatter of horse-drawn carriages rolling over uneven cobblestones, the distant mellow ringing of church bells, and the quiet hiss of gas lamps being lit one by one as dusk settles softly over the dark waters of the Potomac River. Matthew adjusts to this new, complex rhythm, observing his surroundings with the quiet, watchful attention of a boy who has learned early that nothing in life is entirely permanent. Living with his uncle, Matthew is well cared for, yet as the years pass, he harbors a deep, unspoken restlessness. He is a boy without deep roots in the city pavement, and as he grows into his 10th and 11th years, he finds himself drawn continually to the edges of the urban landscape. He wanders down to the quiet docks along the river, spending hours watching the large wooden ships coming and going, carrying stories from far-off places he cannot yet name. He listens to the dark water lapping gently against the wooden piers and watches the sailors tending to their canvas sails. In these quiet moments, looking out over the expanding water, a gentle realization begins to form in his mind. He senses, without fully understanding why, that his life will not ultimately unfold within the familiar walls of his uncle's house, or even within the boundaries of this growing city. There is a much larger world out there, vast and patiently waiting, and the quiet boy by the river is already beginning to feel its irresistible, gentle pull. We follow that gentle, irresistible pull as Matthew, now around 11 or 12 years old, makes his way from the quiet streets of Washington to the busy, sprawling docks of Baltimore. This journey is not a dramatic escape in the middle of the night, nor is it a hurried flight from hardship. Rather, it is a quiet, instinctive movement toward a horizon he has always felt calling to him from the edges of the city. As he arrives in Baltimore in the late 1870s, he steps into an entirely new sensory world, vast and incredibly alive. The air here is thick and heavy with the comforting scent of salt water, damp canvas, and the sharp, clean smell of warm pine tar. There is a steady, rhythmic energy to the waterfront, a slow, unending symphony of tall wooden masts creaking softly in the harbor breeze, thick hemp ropes groaning as they stretch against heavy timber, and the distant, muffled calls of sailors moving purposefully across the wide decks of grand merchant vessels. It is a place of endless arrivals and quiet departures, where the world suddenly feels immense, open, and patiently waiting. Walking slowly along these weathered wooden piers, taking in the towering silhouettes of the ships, the young boy eventually approaches a sturdy merchant vessel named the Hines. Standing small but wonderfully resolute beneath the great curved hull, he introduces himself to its master, Captain Childs. Captain Childs is a genuinely kind man, seasoned by decades spent on the open ocean, with a gentle, discerning eye that looks past the surface. He looks at this quiet, determined boy and immediately recognizes a steady strength, a seeking spirit that mirrors his own early love for the sea. With a warm, welcoming nod and an extended hand, Captain Childs takes Matthew on board as a cabin boy, offering him not just a daily task, but a true place to belong. As Matthew steps off the steady wooden dock and onto the gently swaying deck of the Hines, The familiar land slowly drifts away, and the vast, welcoming arms of the sea open wide to receive him. Life on the ship quickly settles into a comforting, deeply predictable rhythm, the kind of steady, unhurried routine that perfectly anchors a restless mind. Matthew learns to wake in the hushed gray hours of the morning, for the dawn watches, feeling the cool, refreshing ocean mist on his face as the sun slowly begins to paint the eastern horizon in soft, glowing strokes of pink and gold. He finds an enveloping warmth and easy camaraderie down in the ship's galley, listening to the quiet murmur of older sailors sharing peaceful stories over steaming, fragrant cups of coffee and salted bread. And at night, when the upper deck is completely dark save for the brilliant silver light of the stars, he lies in his small bunk and listens to the deep, resonant creak of the wooden hull pushing steadily through the open water. He feels the slow, rhythmic, rocking embrace of the ocean beneath him, lulling him into a deep rest. For the first time since he was a very young child sitting by the hearth in a Maryland cabin, Matthew has found a home. Captain Childs quickly becomes much more than just a commanding officer. He becomes a true father figure, a gentle and patient mentor who carefully tends to the boy's growing mind. In the quiet, peaceful evenings, under the warm amber glow of a softly swaying oil lamp in the captain's private quarters, he teaches Matthew to read and write. He carefully unrolls large, intricate paper maps across his heavy wooden desk, tracing the jagged coastlines of distant continents with a weathered finger, slowly introducing the boy to the vast, fascinating geography of the world. He teaches him the careful, quiet mathematics of navigation, showing him how to read the silent, turning constellations in the night sky, and how to deeply trust the steady, invisible pull of the compass needle. Through immense patience and quiet, daily encouragement, Captain Childs gives Matthew the keys to the world, nurturing a deep, quiet intellect that will serve him beautifully for the rest of his life. The Katie Hines becomes a remarkable floating classroom, safely carrying Matthew across the vast, rolling stretches of the globe. They sail south into the warm turquoise waters of the Caribbean, where the heavy, sweet scent of tropical flowers and damp earth drifts far out across the gentle waves to meet them. They trace the long, sun-baked coastline of Africa, taking in the vibrant colors and the deep, rhythmic hum of unfamiliar shores rising softly from the morning mist. They cross great, quiet oceans to reach the Far East, wandering slowly through ancient harbors thick with the fragrance of drying spices, burning incense, and old, polished wood. Each port of call washes over Matthew in soft, atmospheric strokes, painting his expanding mind with the endless, beautiful textures of the earth. And eventually, their long journeys take them far to the north, sailing into the freezing waters toward the Russian port of Murmansk. Here, looking quietly over the ship's wooden rail, Matthew sees his first true sea ice. He watches the heavy, gray-green light of the Arctic slowly wash over the cold horizon, a silent, breathtaking expanse of chilled water and floating, absolute white stillness. The air grows sharp and completely pure in his lungs, and the ocean itself seems to fall into a profound, heavy hush beneath the icy sky. He does not yet know what this frozen landscape will mean for his distant future, but he feels a deep, quiet reverence for its solitary, unbothered beauty. For years, this rich, constantly moving world is everything Matthew needs, a floating sanctuary of steady learning and quiet companionship. But the sea, in all its boundless beauty, is a place of constant, gentle change, and the seasons of every life must eventually turn. While Matthew is still a teenager, having grown strong, capable, and wise under his mentor's watchful eye, Captain Childs falls ill and quietly passes away. It is a profound, devastating loss, the gentle closing of the only true home Matthew had known since his earliest days. Yet, this passing is handled with the exact same quiet dignity that the sea patiently demands of all who sail upon her. There is no loud ceremony, no sudden pause in the turning of the earth. The deep water simply continues to roll beneath them, the wind continues to catch the heavy canvas sails, and the ship simply keeps moving steadily forward. Matthew stands quietly on the deck, looking out over the endless blue, carrying the soft, quiet grief of a young man who has lost his father for a second time, rocking gently, endlessly, to the eternal rhythm of the ocean. We step back onto the solid, unmoving earth, gently leaving the endless motion of the ocean behind us, as Matthew Henson, now perhaps 14 or 15 years old, finds himself once again on the shores of his homeland. With the passing of Captain Childs, the protective, floating sanctuary of the Katy Hines gently dissolves into memory, leaving Matthew with a vast worldly education, but without a clear, steady direction on land. He is a young man holding an entire globe in his mind, yet standing on a dock with very little in his pockets. And so begins a quiet, unassuming chapter of his life, a period defined by the soft, steady rhythm of itinerant work and patient wandering. Through the early years of the 1880s, Matthew moves quietly from city to city along the eastern seaboard. He works with his hands, taking on the heavy, honest labor of a dockworker in the bustling ports of Boston, feeling the rough grain of wooden crates and the thick, coarse texture of hemp ropes beneath his calloused palms. He travels down to Baltimore, working as a laborer and a waiter, navigating the crowded, noisy spaces of a rapidly industrializing nation. He moves through this landscape as a young black man in an era deeply and rigidly structured by the heavy lines of race. The world he walks through is full of limitations and unyielding boundaries, yet he navigates these realities with a profound, quiet grace. He carries no loud resentment, but rather moves through this restricted landscape with the deep, internal dignity of someone who knows his own worth, simply accepting the terrain as it is while maintaining his own gentle composure. There is a very particular, quiet loneliness to this passage of his life. You can imagine him standing in a dimly lit room, quietly mopping a wooden floor or wiping down a polished counter at the end of a long, ordinary day. In those quiet moments, his mind must have drifted back to the warm, spice-scented breezes of the Far East, the deep, rolling blue of the open ocean at midnight, or the sharp, pale light of the Arctic horizon. To have held the vastness of the world in your eyes and to now find yourself quietly loading wagons in a dusty alleyway requires a special kind of endurance. But Matthew does not sink into despair. Instead, he simply waits. He moves through these days with a patient, open stillness, resting in the quiet understanding that this narrow existence is not the end of his story, but merely a gentle pause between journeys. Eventually, this quiet wandering brings him back to the familiar, sprawling avenues of Washington, D.C. in the mid-1880s. The city has grown and settled since his childhood. It is a place of wide, sweeping streets and monumental architecture, where grand stone government buildings cast long, comforting shadows in the late afternoon sun. The sensory world here is entirely different from the open sea. Instead of the sound of wind in the rigging, there is the steady, rhythmic clatter of horse hooves echoing off the uneven cobblestones. Instead of the smell of pine tar and salt spray, the air carries the scent of damp earth, roasting chestnuts, and the soft, coal-scented smoke of a city in motion. As dusk falls each evening, the streets take on a warm, drowsy glow as gas lamps are lit one by one, their soft yellow light reflecting beautifully on the damp pavements. It is here, around the year 1887, that Matthew finds a steady, comforting anchor. He takes a position at Steinmetz's hat store, a well-regarded shop located right on the bustling thoroughfare of Pennsylvania Avenue. Stepping into the hat shop is like stepping into a quiet, warm refuge away from the busy world outside. The air inside is still and deeply fragrant, carrying the rich, earthy scent of blocked felt, fine imported wool, and softly worn leather. The shop operates on a peaceful, unhurried routine that brings a gentle order to Matthew's days. His mornings begin in a hushed, early light, softly sweeping the pristine wooden floors and carefully dusting the polished glass of the mahogany display cases. He greets the gentlemen who walk through the heavy wooden doors with a warm, respectful nod, helping them find the exact fit and style of a brimmed hat. He spends his afternoons carefully folding wool, arranging inventory, and listening to the muted, rhythmic sounds of the city passing by just outside the large, sunlit front windows. The hat shop provides a temporary, peaceful stillness, a place where the young man can simply breathe and rest in the comfort of a predictable day. It is a deeply restful chapter, a slow decompression between the grand, oceanic world of his childhood and the unimaginably vast, frozen landscapes that still lie far ahead of him in the distance. He is a young man resting in a warm, drowsy room, completely unaware that his life is about to shift once again. He simply stands quietly behind the long wooden counter, surrounded by the soft textures of felt and leather, waiting patiently as the turning world slowly brings the next great chapter directly to his door. It is a perfectly ordinary afternoon in the year 1887, inside the warm, softly lit quiet of Steinmetz's hat store. The city outside moves at its usual steady pace, while inside, Matthew stands peacefully behind the polished wooden counter, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of shaped wool and soft leather. The quiet, rhythmic ticking of a tall clock in the corner gently measures the slow, peaceful passing of the afternoon, creating a sanctuary of stillness away from the busy world. On this particular day, the brass bell above the heavy wooden door chimes softly, announcing the arrival of a customer. A man walks in, seeking a very specific piece of equipment, a durable sun helmet for an upcoming surveying expedition far to the south, in the dense tropical humidity of Nicaragua. This man is Robert Peary, a naval civil engineer with a commanding presence and an internal drive that seems to hum quietly just beneath the surface of his tailored coat. Peary is an ambitious man, possessing a singular focus that has already begun to point his mind toward the vast, uncharted expanses of polar exploration. As Peary explains his needs for the journey, the two men fall into a quiet, unhurried conversation. There is no sudden flash of dramatic destiny in this meeting. Rather, it is a simple, steady recognition between two people who sense something genuinely useful and resilient in one another. Peary, listening to Matthew speak, recognizes a deep, worldly intelligence and a quiet composure that cannot be easily taught. He learns of Matthew's extensive time at sea, his natural understanding of complex navigation, and the steady, enduring strength he has built over years of quiet, honest labor. Recognizing the rare value of such a person, Peary offers Matthew a position on his upcoming expedition, formally hiring him as a valet and personal attendant for the Central American Survey. For Matthew, it is the opening of a door he had been patiently waiting for, a gentle invitation to leave the still, confined space of the hat shop and step back out into the vast, moving world. He quietly accepts. Soon, the cobblestone streets of Washington fade away, replaced by the heavy, enveloping heat of the Nicaraguan jungle. The year is 1887, rolling slowly into 1888, and the environment is a profound shift from everything Matthew has known. The air here is incredibly dense, sweet, and constantly alive with the rhythmic, pulsing sound of insects at dusk, while the slow, muddy rivers wind their way through endless, deep green canopies. They measure the earth foot by careful foot, pulling heavy chains through the thick undergrowth, listening to the soft calls of unfamiliar birds echoing through the humid air. It is a place of thick, clinging moisture and exhausting, daily labor as the surveying crew works to map the difficult terrain for a proposed canal. In this demanding environment, Matthew quickly demonstrates that his capabilities extend far beyond the formal, limited title of a personal valet. While Peary is an engineer accustomed to giving orders and driving the overarching mission forward, Matthew is the one who quietly and efficiently solves the intricate, daily problems that arise in the deep jungle. He seamlessly manages the logistics of the camp, ensures the equipment is meticulously maintained, and navigates the difficult landscape with an intuitive grace that leaves the rest of the men in quiet awe. The dynamic between the two men begins to take shape, settling into a complex but genuinely collaborative rhythm. In the eyes of the world they came from, they are entirely unequal, bound by the rigid social architectures of their time, and both men understand this unspoken reality. Yet, beneath the canopy of the Nicaraguan forest, working side by side in the heavy heat, a different truth begins to gently assert itself. Matthew learns the careful, precise mathematics of land surveying, handling the delicate instruments with the same steady, practiced hands that once managed heavy canvas sails on the open ocean. He reads the land just as naturally as he once read the stars and the sea, earning the deep, unprompted respect of the entire crew. Peary is a complicated, intensely driven man whose deep flaws and single-minded obsessions will only become fully apparent in the distant years to come. But in these early days, he possesses the crucial wisdom to see exactly what is standing in front of him. Peary realizes slowly and completely that what he truly needs for the immense, unforgiving goals he has set for his life is not a servant to manage his coats, but a remarkably capable partner who can help him survive the very edges of the earth. As the long, exhausting months of the Nicaragua survey gradually come to a quiet close, Peary turns his mind toward the true obsession that rests constantly at the center of his thoughts. He looks at Matthew, recognizing the profound strength, the quiet adaptability, and the unwavering endurance that the younger man possesses, and he extends a new invitation. He asks Matthew to accompany him on his next journey, leaving behind the warm, heavy air of the tropics for a landscape that is entirely different, a place of absolute, punishing extremes. It is the quiet beginning of one of the most consequential and complex partnerships in the long history of human exploration. And as they prepare to leave the warm green jungles behind, a new destination settles softly on the horizon, opening a path that will carry them far away to the north, introducing Matthew to a word that will gently, permanently define the rest of his life: the Arctic. We leave the dense, humid air of the southern tropics far behind us now, moving slowly northward as the years turn softly into 1891 and Peary's first major Arctic expedition set sail for the frozen edges of Greenland. The heavy greens of the deep jungle gradually fade from memory, replaced entirely by the vast, cooling expanse of the North Atlantic Ocean as the ship pushes steadily toward the very top of the world. As they approach the northern coast, the landscape that slowly reveals itself is one of profound, hushed stillness and unimaginable scale. This is a world defined by the immense, quiet weight of the continental ice sheet, a great white ocean of frozen water that stretches out endlessly until it meets the pale curve of the horizon. The air here is sharp and incredibly pure, carrying the clean, lonely sounds of the wind moving gently over the snow and the distant, muffled shifting of the deep ice. Along the coastline, dark gray fjords cut deeply into the land, their frigid waters reflecting a summer sun that never quite manages to set, but instead lingers peacefully on the horizon, casting a long, eternal golden light across the silent, unmoving earth. Yet, this magnificent and austere environment is not empty. Along these distant shores live the Inuit people of northern Greenland, a resilient and deeply resourceful community who have called this ice their home for thousands of unhurried years. For many outsiders arriving on these shores, the Arctic is simply an adversary to be battled, a harsh and unforgiving wilderness to be conquered. But Matthew looks upon this place and its people with a profoundly different spirit. He watches the Inuit with quiet, respectful attention, recognizing immediately that their survival is not a matter of fighting the landscape, but of moving in perfect, deeply understood harmony with it. He possesses a rare and beautiful openness, a gentle willingness to quiet his own assumptions and simply learn from those who already know the way. This deep, natural respect reveals itself most wonderfully in Matthew's remarkable, almost instinctive gift for language. While Peary and the other American members of the expedition struggle with the complex, unfamiliar sounds of the local tongue, Matthew listens to the cadence of the Inuit language, Inuit, and slowly begins to absorb its rhythm into his own mind. It is not a rushed or forceful study, but a patient, daily practice of listening and repeating, of sitting by a warm fire and paying careful attention to the voices around him. Within a matter of weeks and months, he finds himself able to communicate in ways that the rest of the crew simply cannot. You can imagine the quiet, gentle wonder of those early interactions, the slow, beautiful unlocking of another tongue, as a full, newly learned sentence finally lands softly in the cold air, and an Inuit face across the glowing hearth smiles back in genuine understanding. Through this bridge of shared language, Matthew becomes a devoted and humble student of the ice. The Inuit generously share their ancient knowledge with him, teaching him the intricate, essential skills needed to survive in a world of permanent winter. He learns the careful, rhythmic art of driving a dog sled, spending long hours understanding the complex, unspoken communication between a driver and his team as they move swiftly across the frozen plains. He learns how to read the subtle, shifting colors of the pale Arctic sky, understanding how a slight change in the light or the wind can gently announce an incoming storm long before the first snow begins to fall. He watches patient hands at work and learns how to carefully sew animal furs together, creating garments that hold the body's warmth close and keep the bitter cold firmly at bay. And perhaps most importantly, he learns how to carve blocks of packed snow and build an igloo, creating a small breathing sanctuary of warmth and shelter in the middle of a vast, frozen emptiness, because he approaches them not as tools for an expedition, but as true teachers and companions. The relationship Matthew builds with the Inuit community is entirely different from the transactional exchanges maintained by the rest of the crew. It is a bond rooted in deep, mutual respect and genuine, enduring affection. He is welcomed into their homes and their lives, stepping out of the harsh winds and into the warm, comforting shelter of their snow houses. Inside, the air is thick and softly fragrant, with the smell of burning seal oil lamps casting a low, warm, flickering light against the curved, icy walls. In these quiet, sheltered moments, surrounded by the soft murmur of Inuktitut and the gentle, communal warmth of a shared meal, Matthew finds a profound sense of peace. Outside, the Arctic continues its slow, majestic turning. The dogs rest quietly in the snow, their heavy fur protecting them as they sleep soundly through the wind, their rhythmic breathing adding a soft, comforting sound to the stillness of the camp. As the long summer eventually gives way, the sky slowly deepens into a rich, particular shade of blue, the heavy, beautiful blue of the Arctic twilight settling softly over the endless snow. Matthew stands outside in this quiet light, breathing in the cold, clean air, feeling the immense, unbothered silence of the world pressing gently against him. When the long months of the expedition finally draw to a close in 1892, and the ship begins its slow, steady journey back across the ocean toward the crowded, noisy streets of the United States, Matthew leaves the ice behind, but it does not leave him. He carries the deep, quiet rhythm of the North back with him to the changing cities of his homeland. He has traveled across the world from the warm Maryland soil to the vast oceans and through the thick jungles of the South, but standing in the freezing, absolute quiet of northern Greenland, surrounded by people who accept him fully and completely for the first time in his life, a gentle, unwavering realization has settled into his heart. He knows, with the deep, quiet certainty of a man who has finally stopped wandering, that he has found his world and that something deep within his own quiet nature was always meant for the ice. We have arrived at the long, quiet exhale before a monumental journey begins. The calendar gently turns to the summer of 1908, and the heavy, humid warmth of a New York City afternoon is slowly fading behind them. The city watches quietly from the docks as a specially designed ship, the SS Roosevelt, gently pulls away from the crowded, noisy harbor and turns her heavy iron bow toward the wide, open expanse of the North Atlantic. This is the final expedition, the quiet culmination of all those long, freezing years of preparation and patient endurance, designed with a single, unwavering goal, resting softly in the distance, 90 degrees north. The voyage northward is a slow, methodical cooling of the world, a gentle transition from the familiar, crowded Earth into a vast, empty stillness. The SS Roosevelt is a remarkable vessel, uniquely shaped and profoundly strengthened to withstand the crushing, immense pressure of the polar pack ice. You can imagine the comforting, deep hum of her massive engines, a steady, rhythmic vibration that travels through the heavy timber and steel, lulling the men to sleep in their narrow, warm bunks below deck. The air down there is thick with the reassuring scent of burning coal, warm oil, and salted canvas, providing a small, floating sanctuary of warmth. But above, on the wide wooden decks, the air grows steadily sharper and colder with every passing day. The ocean water gradually shifts, from the vibrant rolling blue of the mid-Atlantic to a heavy slate gray, until finally the first brilliant white fragments of sea ice begin to appear drifting silently past the dark hull like soft, floating ghosts in the pale, eternal twilight. The team assembled for this final, defining push is a small, carefully chosen group of men who have been seasoned by the ice and bound together by years of profound, quiet trust. Alongside Peary and Matthew Henson are 4 incredibly skilled Inuit guides, men whose endurance and deep knowledge of the frozen landscape are absolutely essential to the journey. Their names are Uda, Egegingwa, Siglu, and Uka. They are chosen not just for their immense physical strength, but for their steady, unbroken resilience, their quiet ability to read the subtle language of the wind, and the deep, unspoken understanding they share with Matthew. forged over countless miles of shared travel in the permanent winter. They understand the ice not as an enemy to be fought, but as a living, breathing entity to be respected and carefully navigated. As the ship pushes patiently through the narrowing, ice-choked channels of the high Arctic, listening to the heavy, rhythmic thud of the wooden hull pressing against the frozen sea, they eventually reach the absolute edge of the North American continent. They arrive at Cape Columbia, resting on the northernmost shore of Ellesmere Island. This is the final outpost of solid land, a place of profound, staggering isolation, where the air is so completely still and the temperature so deeply low that the cold itself feels like a heavy, physical presence settling softly over the camp. You can hear the soft, muffled panting of the sled dogs as they rest in the snow, their thick coats protecting them from the biting wind. Here, they establish their base, surrounded by a world that has simplified into only two quiet elements: the endless gray of the darkening sky and the vast, unmoving white of the frozen ocean stretching endlessly toward the pole. The strategy they employ to conquer this final, unimaginable distance is a quiet, rhythmic marvel of human endurance known as the relay system. Instead of moving as one large, exhausting group, the expedition breathes like a slow, gently expanding lung. Teams of men and dogs move outward in careful shifts, patiently breaking a trail through the jagged, chaotic ice and establishing small, vital caches of food and fuel along the way. Once a depot is securely placed, that team quietly turns back, returning to the warmth of the ship, while the next group moves forward along the newly blazed path, carrying the journey just a little bit further into the unknown. It is a deeply beautiful human rhythm, men walking patiently northward and turning softly back, while the vast, indifferent ice silently receives and releases them, erasing their footsteps with the next gentle drift of snow. As this slow, methodical progression unfolds across the ice, Matthew Henson's role gently transitions from a trusted partner into the quiet, essential center of the entire endeavor. Robert Peary is a man driven by a decades-long, all-consuming obsession, but his physical body has paid a devastating price for his unyielding ambition. His feet have been severely damaged by old, lingering frostbite from earlier journeys, making every single step across the uneven, shattered ice a quiet, hidden agony. Peary presses forward with a complicated, suffering dignity, a man enduring immense pain simply to see the end of his life's great work. In the face of this silent struggle, it is Matthew who steps fully into the light, breaking the trail, repairing the heavy wooden sledges with cold, practiced hands, and managing the complex daily logistics of the moving camp. He assumes this immense weight without resentment or fanfare, simply doing what must be done to gently carry the expedition forward. By the time the final, decisive weeks of the journey arrive, the atmosphere on the ice settles into a profound, sacred hush. The last of the supporting relay teams has quietly dropped their supplies, turned their sleds around, and vanished into the blowing snow of the southern horizon, leaving the final party completely alone. There are now only 6 men remaining on the ice: Peary, Henson, Uda, Egejingwa, Siglu, and Ukwa. They stand together in the absolute, enveloping silence of a world that is about to be crossed, breathing in the thin, sharp air, completely isolated from the rest of humanity. The ice groans gently in the distance, a deep, resonant sound that echoes beneath their feet, reminding them that the ground they walk upon is constantly, slowly, in motion. Ahead of them lies 500 miles of shifting, groaning, unpredictable sea ice, a vast and quiet emptiness leading directly to the top of the world. And as they prepare to take their first deliberate steps toward the pole, there is no fear, no rushed urgency, only the deep, quiet peace of a long journey finally reaching its quiet, inevitable end. As the final support team fades quietly into the southern horizon, the 6 remaining men begin the long, deliberate 40-day march toward the geographic North Pole. The daily rhythm of this journey is not a desperate race, but a slow, deeply repetitive cycle of endurance. They wake in the profound, heavy cold before dawn, shaking the frost from their sleeping furs and listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of the sled dogs waiting patiently in the snow. They move forward in careful, steady increments, walking across a landscape that is both unimaginably beautiful and entirely indifferent to their presence. There are long hours of silent marching, broken only by the gentle sound of wooden sled runners sliding smoothly over packed snow, and the quiet, encouraging calls to the dogs in the soft, flowing syllables of Inuktitut. At the end of each exhausting day, they build a brief temporary shelter, resting their deeply tired bodies for just a few hours before beginning the cycle all over again, under the pale, eternal light of the Arctic sky. The environment they are crossing is not a solid, unchanging continent, but a vast frozen ocean that is constantly, quietly in motion. They navigate through towering pressure ridges, enormous blocks of ice pushed together by the invisible currents of the dark sea beneath them, rising into the air like frozen, shattered waves. They carefully cross narrow leads, the slow, silent opening of the ice pack, where the dark, freezing water of the Arctic Ocean suddenly reveals itself, before the shifting earth slowly closes the gap once more. Even as they sleep, they can feel the gentle, imperceptible drift of the ice beneath them, a quiet reminder that they are walking across the delicate, moving surface of the deep water. It requires a profound, almost meditative focus to simply keep moving forward, placing one heavy foot in front of the other, mile after quiet mile, drawn endlessly northward by the invisible pull of the earth. Eventually, the long, grueling weeks of marching begin to quietly draw to a close. On the 6th of April, 1909, the calculations and the silent, guiding stars indicate that the journey is nearly complete. As they make their final push, Matthew Henson, breaking the trail and gently guiding his team of dogs, finds himself pulling ahead of the rest of the group. He moves steadily across the flat white plain, his seasoned eyes scanning the unbroken horizon, until he finally brings his sled to a gentle halt. He has arrived at a place that looks exactly like the hundreds of miles they have just crossed, yet he knows, through the careful mathematics of their navigation, that this is the end. He is approximately 45 minutes ahead of Robert Peary. In the immense, breathless quiet of the morning, Matthew reaches into his sled, unrolls a carefully folded American flag, and plants it firmly into the frozen sea. He stands up, brushing the snow from his heavy furs, and waits peacefully for the others to arrive. Soon, the soft sound of sled runners approaches, and Peary arrives, accompanied by Uda, Igagingwa, Siglu, and Ukia. Together, these 6 men, bound by years of deep, unspoken trust and immense shared hardship, stand quietly at 90 degrees north. They are the first human beings to verifiably reach the geographic top of the world. But this moment of profound historical achievement is not marked by loud triumph or grand ceremony. Instead, it arrives with the gentle, natural inevitability of a slow dawn breaking over a silent landscape. There is no monument waiting for them, no sudden change in the atmosphere, only an immense, overwhelming stillness. The 6 men simply stand together on a flat, white expanse of ice, resting under a pale, washed-out sky, while the wind drops away to absolute nothingness. Matthew looks around him, slowly taking in the magnitude of where he is standing. He sees no mountains, no shorelines, no distant landmarks to guide the eye. In every single direction he turns, he is looking south. There is nothing but the vast frozen surface of the ocean meeting the soft curve of the sky in an endless, perfect circle of white. It is a place of profound, beautiful emptiness, a landscape completely stripped of the complicated noise of the human world. In this perfect, silent center of the earth, he feels a deep, gentle peace settling over him. He is entirely present, resting quietly in a moment that very few human beings will ever know, holding the quiet satisfaction of a life's great work, finally, completely realized. But the ice is not a place where anyone can stay forever, and soon, the delicate work of returning home must begin. They pack up their sleds, look out over the frozen horizon one last time, and slowly turn their backs to the pole, beginning the long, exhausted march south. The return journey is a steady, fading rhythm of sheer endurance, retracing their faint footsteps across the shifting ice pack, guided by the familiar, comforting thought of the ship waiting patiently at the edge of the land. For weeks, they march, until finally, the dark, heavy silhouette of the SS Roosevelt appears gently through the blowing snow, resting safely against the shore. They climb aboard, their bodies profoundly exhausted but deeply at peace, leaving the great silent emptiness of the Arctic Ocean behind them, slowly returning to the warm, complicated world that is waiting to hear their story. We slowly leave the pure, absolute silence of the Arctic behind us now, as the heavy wooden hull of the Roosevelt carries the men back across the ocean, returning them gently to the complicated, crowded shores of civilization. The year is 1909, and the transition from the endless white plains to the busy, smoky harbors of the eastern seaboard is a profound shock to the senses. The quiet peace of the frozen ocean is quickly replaced by the heavy scent of burning coal, the loud, rhythmic clatter of horse-drawn wagons on cobblestones, and the distant, shrill sounds of factory whistles blowing in the humid air. And almost immediately upon their return, the quiet, personal triumph of their immense achievement is met with the loud, frantic energy of the modern era. A controversy has erupted in their absence, as another explorer, Frederick Cook, claims to have reached the pole a full year earlier. The city newspapers are instantly filled with loud, endless debates, and the public's attention is entirely consumed by the swirling conflict between Peary and Cook, leaving very little room for anything else. In the midst of this turbulent, noisy atmosphere, Matthew Henson's own profound experience is simply, quietly set aside. It is a deeply complicated reality to observe from a historical distance, a soft and heavy injustice that unfolds without any dramatic fanfare. Because he is a black man living in a deeply segregated society, and because he is technically employed by Peary, his voice is not sought by the reporters gathering on the docks, and his immense, critical contributions are not amplified by the scientific institutions of the day. Robert Peary eventually receives the grand, official acclaim of the nation, recognized by Congress and the National Geographic Society with heavy gold medals and formal, brightly lit ceremonies. Meanwhile, Matthew is gently relegated to the shadows, treated as an afterthought in a story that he himself helped to write with his own frozen footsteps. This erasure is not an active, aggressive suppression, but rather a passive, quiet overlooking. The rigid, unyielding social structures of the early 20th century simply do not have the capacity or the imagination to fully acknowledge the reality of a black man leading the way to the top of the world. And so, Matthew accepts this quiet fading with the exact same enduring, graceful dignity that he brought to the heavy ice. He does not raise his voice in anger, nor does he allow the world's indifference to diminish the quiet, unshakable truth resting safely inside his own memory. He knows exactly what he has done, and he understands deeply that the polar sea requires no paper certificates to prove its vastness. He makes a gentle, patient attempt to share his journey with the world, sitting down in the quiet evening hours to write out his memories. In the year 1912, he publishes a softly spoken memoir titled A Negro Explorer at the North Pole. It is a remarkable, deeply human book filled with the rich, sensory textures of the Arctic, the complex, silent mathematics of navigation, and the genuine, enduring warmth of his time with the Inuit people. Yet, it arrives in a society that is not yet ready to listen, and the book is largely ignored by the wider public, slipping quietly onto dusty shelves and fading softly into the forgotten corners of history. Needing to support himself as the years move slowly forward, Matthew seeks out positions that might honor his unparalleled experience, applying for work that requires a deep understanding of leadership, endurance, and logistics. But those doors remain softly closed to him, locked by the quiet, pervasive prejudices of the era. So, with the same patient adaptability that allowed him to survive the deep winter, he simply adjusts his course and finds a new, steady rhythm to carry him through his days. Eventually, he accepts a modest, reliable position as a clerk and a messenger at the United States Customs House in New York City. This is a job he will hold quietly and faithfully for more than 3 decades. It is a profound, beautifully quiet contradiction. A life lived in 2 entirely different worlds. You can imagine him waking in the soft gray light of a city morning, putting on a simple, well-worn suit, and making his daily rhythmic commute to the heavy stone building in Lower Manhattan. He spends his days carefully sorting paper files, walking down long, dimly lit corridors, and quietly delivering messages between heavy wooden desks. The air in the customs house is warm and heavy with the scent of old paper, damp wool, and polished brass, a world away from the sharp, pure wind of the polar sea. His colleagues in the customs house likely interact with him in the most ordinary of ways, handing him simple ledgers to carry or asking him to quietly run an errand across the street, completely unaware of the unimaginably vast history standing right in front of them. He responds to these mundane requests with a polite, steady nod, performing his duties flawlessly while holding the deep, silent knowledge of the ancient constellations he once used to navigate the darkest nights on Earth. As he sits quietly at his desk, watching the slow, steady turning of the clock on the wall, his mind must have occasionally drifted back to the endless white horizon. When the gentle winter snows finally fell over the busy streets of New York, softly covering the pavement, he must have remembered the blinding permanent whiteouts of Greenland and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the sled dogs resting in the cold. To have walked across a frozen ocean, to have stood at the absolute center of the earth, under a sky of permanent twilight, and to now find oneself quietly filing paperwork in a federal building, requires a kind of internal peace that very few people ever achieve. He carries this immense contrast without any heavy burden of bitterness. He moves through the crowded, noisy streets of the city with a gentle, unseen greatness, an ordinary-looking man carrying the most extraordinary memories. The tension between what he had truly accomplished and what the world allowed him to be settles softly into the background of his life, a gentle sorrow that he bears with absolute grace, resting deeply in the quiet knowledge of a life profoundly lived. As the long years of public obscurity slowly unfold, Matthew's life is not defined by the empty spaces of what the world denied him, but rather beautifully shaped by the genuine warmth of what he quietly built. We travel now to the vibrant, growing streets of Harlem in the early 20th century. Here, away from the quiet, dusty corridors of the customs house and the endless freezing winds of the Arctic, Matthew finds a deeply comforting anchor in his marriage to a woman named Lucy Jane Ross. They had married gently in the years just before his final polar journey, and upon his return, Lucy becomes the steady, peaceful center of his world. She is a woman of profound grace and quiet strength, a true partner who walks alongside him through the long, ordinary stretches of a remarkably unordinary life. Their life together in Harlem during the 1910s, 20s, and 30s settles into a beautifully domestic, unhurried rhythm. You can imagine their modest apartment filled with the soft, inviting light of a Sunday morning, the air carrying the warm, familiar scent of coffee and fresh bread. Outside their windows, the neighborhood is alive with an extraordinary cultural vitality, a community resting comfortably in its own shared rhythms. Matthew moves through these familiar streets not as a famous explorer demanding recognition, but simply as a gentle, respected elder of the community. He walks to the local church on quiet weekend mornings, tipping his hat to neighbors on the sidewalk, deeply known and appreciated by the people who share his daily world. The grand, vast scale of the polar ice is softly replaced by the intimate, comforting boundaries of a neighborhood block, and he finds a genuine, deep contentment in this smaller, warmer world. Yet, the immense world of the North never entirely leaves his mind. In the quiet evenings, sitting comfortably in his armchair with the soft yellow light of a reading lamp washing over the room, his thoughts occasionally drift back to the deep snows of Greenland. He keeps a quiet, enduring connection to the Inuit families who had welcomed him so warmly, holding on to the softly spoken syllables of Inuktitut like a treasured, distant melody. And he holds, with deep and private tenderness, the memory of his son Anoka, resting far away in a world of permanent winter. These are not bitter memories of a life left behind, but rather soft, glowing embers of a beautifully expansive past, kept warm and safe within the quiet sanctuary of his heart. Outside the comforting walls of Harlem, the formal institutions of the exploring world continue to keep their doors quietly, firmly closed to him. The prestigious Explorers Club, a gathering place for the men who mapped the edges of the earth, refuses his admission for decades, unable to look past the rigid lines of race. But Matthew responds to this long exclusion with an extraordinary, unyielding patience. Having walked across a frozen ocean and endured the absolute mind-altering darkness of the polar night, he understands that the fragile judgments of a social club hold no true weight against the vastness of the physical earth. He simply waits, resting in his own quiet dignity, knowing that his footsteps are already permanently frozen into the history of the globe. And while the grand institutions look away, he He continues to share his story softly with anyone who genuinely wishes to listen. He sits across small wooden tables with journalists, sharing a quiet cup of tea as he gently unrolls the vast white maps of his memory. He speaks to wide-eyed schoolchildren, his voice low and comforting, painting pictures of giant iron meteorites and teams of sled dogs moving gracefully across the ice. He finds a deep, sustaining joy in these small, intimate conversations, surrounded by a close circle of friends and neighbors who recognize his immense worth and simply love him for the gentle, steady man he is. As the 1930s slowly give way to the 1940s, the world itself begins to subtly, gently turn. A new generation is quietly coming of age, a generation that is beginning to look back at the grand narratives of the past and ask thoughtful questions about the spaces left completely blank in the history books. Slowly, like the first, hesitant rays of dawn breaking over a long winter night, people begin to look for the man who walked to the top of the world. They begin to find their way to Harlem, tracing the forgotten path back to Matthew Henson, resting comfortably in his long, quiet evening, entirely unbothered by the wait, and perfectly ready to be found. As that new generation begins to look back and ask questions, the heavy, stubbornly closed doors of the exploring world slowly, finally begin to open. In the year 1937, when Matthew has reached the quiet, reflective age of 70, the prestigious Explorers Club at last extends a formal invitation, officially welcoming him as their very first Black member. It is a warm, deeply respectful gesture, arriving many long decades after he had originally returned from the freezing darkness of the Polar Sea. Yet he accepts this long-delayed honor without a single trace of bitterness or loud, prideful triumph. He simply walks through those heavy wooden doors with the exact same gentle, unbothered dignity that had once carried him across the shattered, drifting ice, taking his rightful, quiet place among the men who had spent their lives mapping the farthest edges of the earth. Through the late 1930s and gracefully into the 1940s, a gentle, steady accumulation of recognition begins to softly wash over his life. Thoughtful writers and journalists begin to seek out his quiet, comfortable apartment in Harlem, sitting in his living room and publishing carefully written magazine profiles that slowly introduce his remarkable name to a country that had almost entirely forgotten him. Warm invitations to speak at local schools and historical societies begin to arrive in the Daily Mail, and the true, vast scope of his Arctic journey slowly, patiently takes root in the public mind. While the wider world outside becomes deeply consumed by the loud, devastating noise of the Second World War, Matthew lives quietly through his 70s, resting peacefully in the familiar, comforting rhythms of his neighborhood, watching gently as his own deeply personal history slowly expands and brightens in the minds of the people who come to sit and listen. In the year 1944, the United States Navy formally acknowledges his extraordinary, unparalleled service in the high Arctic, presenting him with a special silver medal in a small, quietly dignified ceremony. It is a moment of profound, simple acknowledgement, a peaceful afternoon that gently honors a lifetime of quiet, unimaginably difficult achievement on the ice. A few years later, in 1948, the halls of academia open to him as Morgan State University gently awards him an honorary degree. For a man whose formal education essentially ended as a young wandering cabin boy, and whose deepest, truest learning came from the patient lessons of a ship's captain on the rolling Atlantic and the ancient, generous wisdom of the Inuit under the polar stars, it is a beautifully profound moment of deep respect. The long, quiet arc of his public recognition eventually reaches its highest, most formal point in the spring of 1954. Matthew, now 87 years old, travels gently back to Washington, D.C., returning to the very city where he had once wandered the uneven cobblestone streets as a restless, silently observing boy. He is welcomed into the warm, historic rooms of the White House, where he is honored directly by President Dwight Eisenhower. You can imagine him standing quietly in that elegant, softly lit room, an old man with soft, snow-white hair, wearing a sharply tailored dark suit and holding the profound, gentle calmness of a life entirely fulfilled. Hands are warmly shaken, formal photographs are carefully taken, and a nation softly, finally acknowledges the quiet greatness of the man who walked at the very front of the line to the top of the world. After this beautiful, belated season of warmth and national recognition, the long and remarkable journey of his life draws to a deeply peaceful close. On the 9th of April, 1955, at the age of 88, Matthew Alexander Henson passes away quietly in New York City. There is no heavy sorrow or sudden disruption in his departure, only the gentle, natural stillness of a beautifully lived life reaching its final, quiet rest. His passing carries the exact same profound, unbothered silence as the endless polar ice he knew so completely, a peaceful settling, a gentle returning to the earth. He is laid to rest softly in a quiet cemetery in the Bronx, with his devoted wife Lucy Jane Ross remaining faithfully by his side, bringing a beautifully expansive and quietly magnificent story to a gentle, perfectly peaceful end. More than 3 decades after his quiet passing, the slowly turning wheels of history finally complete their arc. In the spring of 1988, the remains of Matthew Alexander Henson, alongside his devoted wife Lucy Jane Ross, are gently moved to their final resting place in the hallowed grounds of Arlington National Cemetery. It is a quiet, profoundly dignified ceremony attended by family members, formal officials, and a small, dedicated gathering of people who had worked patiently for years to ensure that this great man was given the resting place his country owed him. Under the soft, rustling leaves of the old trees, the nation at last formally gathers him into the quiet fold of its most honored citizens. Yet, his truest and most beautiful legacy does not rest solely beneath the manicured green lawns of a national monument. Far to the north, under the endless freezing sky of Greenland, another beautiful thread of his life continued to quietly unwind. In the 1980s, a historian named S. Allen Counter traveled to the high Arctic and softly uncovered a living story, finding Matthew's son Anouka and an entire family of children and grandchildren who had grown up safely knowing their rich heritage. They knew the story of the gentle explorer who had walked with their ancestors, remembering him not by his formal American title, but by the softly spoken Inuktitut name Maripaluk, which simply and beautifully means the kind one. As the years continue to unfold, his name begins to gently settle across the landscape of his homeland. Ships like the USCGC Henson carry his memory back out into the open water, while the Matthew Henson Earth Conservation Center and numerous quiet schools in Maryland and Washington, D.C. ensure that his remarkable journey is softly spoken aloud to each new generation. These are small, warm tributes, like names read gently in the fading light before sleep, honoring a man whose true measure was never found in what the world gave him, but rather in the immense, quiet endurance of what he gave to the world without ever being asked. And as our story finally draws to a peaceful close, we let our minds drift away from the warm, busy cities, traveling slowly back to the very top of the world. At 90 degrees north, the frozen ocean remains exactly as he left it, resting in permanent stillness, completely indifferent to the loud, changing politics of the human world. It is a landscape of profound, untouched silence, stretching out endlessly in a perfect, unbroken circle of white under a pale, eternal sky. The wind moves softly over the heavy snow, gently smoothing out the surface of the earth, peacefully erasing any footprints that might disturb the deep rest of the land. The ice is still there, just as he left it, white and still and vast, keeping its quiet